take them down and take them down and take them down, take them down, take them down and take them down and take them down. As you look, the whole room explode down and as you look, the whole room explode down and...
Okay, hi, I'm Idan, and I'm going to talk to you guys about typography, which is something that's near and dear to my heart. As was presented, he's not lying, I'm one of Django's core developers, but actually I'm not really a core developer. I'm what's called Django's core designer. We actually have 2 of them now. As in, they decided that having design talent is something that they wanted, and they thought it was so important that they should have it on the core team. Like, we need to have this kind of knowledge in-house. And so they brought me on board, and I'm a hybrid designer developer. I'm one of those people that does a little bit of both. And for my day job, I have a data visualization studio. It's called Umbrella. If you have data and you need to, explain it to somebody and you need help with that, that's us. And we have a product that we're working on called Pushpin, which is geo-analytics. So if you have information events and you need to be able to display them, analytics for your geographical data. So stuff like that. So anyway, that's what I do. But I'm not here to talk to you about that. So why am I talking about typography at a conference about like server-side dev and rock and roll or whatever the fuck the tagline is? Well, so as developers, we do a lot of things, right? We care about all these different subjects, caching and how do we do authentication and all this stuff to deliver a good experience to the people who use our applications. But it turns out that typography is something that you, even though you're a server-side developer, really need to give a shit about because it makes such a difference to your application, to your product, to the experience that you deliver to your users, far more so than like 99% of the other stuff on this list. Like, who cares if your JavaScript is minified? So it'll like make your page load like 10 milliseconds slower. I promise you, your time is better spent providing a better interface to your information. So let's talk a little bit about psychology first, right? What makes us think that something is true, or what makes us think that something is persuasive? Daniel Kahneman, who's a famous cognitive psychologist, he wrote that it has a lot to do with cognitive strain. Like, when we look at something, if we have to think very hard in order to process it, it reduces the persuasiveness of that information. So if you want to be persuasive in your product, when you present information to people, if you present text to people, what he said is the first thing you should do is you should maximize legibility because it increases your credibility in the eyes of the user at a subconscious level. But it's true, and this is based on actual research. And then a nice gentleman from the New York Times, oh man, low contrast, fail. Well, I hope it'll be okay. Those are the font names on the left, even if you can't see them. Nice gentleman from the New York Times actually followed up and did an experiment. They took the same set of facts, like an information, a little bit of story, and they presented it to a lot of people. But they presented it with a randomly different set of typefaces every time. And it turned out that when they presented it in a typeface that was serious, it's actually the first one, the one on the top. This serious serif typeface, they had a 1.5% agreement advantage, meaning 1.5% more people agreed with the text. They said, oh yeah, that's probably true, than, for example, any of the other ones. And that might not sound like a lot, but when you think about that in the context of sales, you think Amazon wouldn't kill to have 1.5% more sales? Would you not want 1.5% more of whatever it is that you're trying to do? And for a sufficiently large sample size, you have 45,000 people that are exposed to your product, you have 682 more customers because they're convinced by your type. So you should give a shit about type because it matters. And like I said, all of this is based on science. Oh, why is it not advancing? Oh, come on. There we go. So it's pretty clear that using good type has a strong effect on audiences. So what is typography, right? It's part art, it's part science. How do you present textual information? And like everything of this genre, there's rules, there's conventions, there's fashions, things that come and go. It's a lot like architecture, good typography. It has a lot of the same like hallmarks, and it's no coincidence that we use the same language to describe architecture and typography. It maps onto that very, very well. We're building these virtual spaces, our products, where people spend time and they interact. They reside in these spaces. And so thinking about it like architecture makes a lot of sense. You're trying to create a space that will move people in a certain way, will make them feel playful or serious or excited or apprehensive. You're trying to create some emotion or instill some meaning or convince somebody of an idea. Architects have been doing this for a long, long time. And now we are too. We're just slowly waking up to the fact that we're doing the same job they are. Olivier Reichenstein of Information Architects, he's famous and stuff. So he wrote these two seminal posts, Web Design is 95% Typography and the 100% Easy to Read Standard. After this talk, go and read them all. The URL is there and the thing will all be online. You don't have to write anything down. Where he basically argues that most of the things that we present, like you take away the images, for most applications, the primary channel of information that you're delivering to users is type, it's text. So you got to make that text as readable and legible as possible to have the maximum advantage. So we make our products legible so that they'll be like open and welcoming and safe. People feel like nothing bad will happen to them if they use your product because they're comforted, they feel in control. And we want to make our type beautiful because as humans we're engineered to think that beautiful things perform better. Study after study shows that we equate beauty with performance in the same way that we equate, like a beautiful member of the opposite sex. Oh, they must be good at making babies. There's a reason why we think that beauty is like a naturally important trait. But it's not just that, it's also practicality. Like when you're designing a product, you only have so much time and so much energy to spend on different things. And type is its own kind of user interface. Like a good application of like minimal type can be a very simple, minimum viable product. It's very practical to build with it. And it scales up and it scales down. When you look type, thinking about type and thinking about your interface in terms of type, it scales all the way down to when you're wireframing and sketching and just thinking about how your product is laid out. And it scales all the way up to like finished, polished products. And when you look at, sort of this trend towards flat design, I actually don't like the term flat design because I think it really should be called type design. And even though I didn't find like a good slide to show this, we've actually been doing like grid systems and the layout of type in grids for centuries. This is something that's not new. Print designers have known this for a long time. So type is the low-hanging fruit. You can do a lot with type for relatively little investment. You get a lot of bang for your buck. So until now, I've hopefully convinced you of why it's important to care about typography when you're building these products. Now I'm actually going to go into like some nitty-gritty details. From here on out, it's all like, here are some rules, here are some best practices. So sit back, relax, and let the best practices wash over you like a soothing balm. Okay, designing with type happens on two levels, macro and micro, or micro and macro. And the micro is all about the internal properties of a typeface, right? Like the shapes of the letters, the relative distance between the letters, legibility, things that have to do with like the actual, like the micro properties of your type. And the macro is more about proportion, like how are you spacing text on the page, blocks of text, how do they interact with each other, how are they spaced relative to one another, where are your like titles relative to your body text and what shape do they have. All these things are the macro properties of text. And again, you should be hearing these parallels to these concepts in architecture. Right, so the macro has to do with proportions, right? And around like 300 BC, Euclid discovers phi. Everybody knows phi. Who here doesn't know what phi is? A few people. Okay, phi. Phi is the golden ratio. It's like 1.618, blah, blah, blah. It's a irrational number, so it goes on forever, to 1. And basically it says that like A plus B is to A as A is to B. And I guess that doesn't really matter, except insofar as that you see this pattern over and over again everywhere in nature. And it turns out that as humans, we find this ratio to be intrinsically pleasing and beautiful. And we discovered it like a long, long time ago. We found this out. And even ancient architecture made use of this ratio for producing these like pleasing forms. When you look at the Pantheon, like the golden ratio is all over this thing. Like lots of books will tell you so. Open up Wikipedia and you'll see it all over the place. But even before like the advent, like, when we're thinking about type and not buildings, even before we invented the printing press, scribes, the people that would write out books by hand, gave thought to like the user experience of books. This is all horribly distorted, and I'm actually kind of bummed about it because it sort of destroys the point that I'm trying to make. This is supposed to be taller, but whatever, crap video, sorry. So the scribes, they gave a thought to how books were laid out and the proportions of text on the page. And you have to think that when books originally, started being a thing, every one was a fantastically expensive thing. It was like buying a car, because you'd have to have a whole team of people work for a long, long time, educated people like us. It's like employing a company full of us in order to make one thing. And think how expensive it is to develop like an application. That's what it was like developing a book. And so they gave a lot of thought to how books would be used, the user experience of books and the layout of type. And because you're not going to be printing like another version, if there's an error, you have to leave some room in the margins for notes and for updates. Like, this is no longer true. It's been superseded by new information. Or even just where you put your fingers on the page, right? They didn't want people putting their fingers on the actual text because it would make the text slowly fade away. And if your book fades away in 5 years, then you have to go buy another car. So that's not so fun. And then in 1436, Gutenberg, a German goldsmith, invented movable type. And this is how it looked. All of a sudden, we can make books a lot faster and a lot nicer. And in the beginning, they emulated what like old handwritten physical books looked like. They tried to mimic it. They used the same sort of shapes, and again, you can't see it because of this projector, but the ratio of the text area on the page is actually it has the same proportion as the shape of the page itself. So they use the intrinsic size of these pages, these folios, to decide how to lay out the central block of type. But now we don't have a fixed canvas anymore, right? We're no longer making books. We're making things for screens. And screens are small, they're big, they're medium, they're landscape, they're portrait, they're high density, they're low density. There are a lot of different kinds of screens. We no longer have this fixed canvas we can rely on to supply proportion because different people see our content on different size screens. So how do we use proportion anyway to enhance legibility of our text? Basically, there are three factors of legibility, and all three of these have to do with proportion. That's size, measure, and leading. The size is exactly what you'd expect it to be. It's the size of your text, right? How big is your type? The measure is the width of the body of your text, right? How many characters do you have on a line? And the third is called leading, which is the space. It's what you would normally think of as spacing if you're like working in Microsoft Word. Except it's called leading because back when printing presses were new, they'd add more space between lines by putting thin strips of lead between the lines of the metal type. So that's why it's called leading. And these three are the three primary bits of proportion that you use to control legibility. So size. In type, we have a scale, the typographer's scale. It's one of many scales. It's a lot like musical scales, right? In the same way that there's the pentatonic scale, like so much music from all over the world is based on this scale because it has an inherently pleasing set of ratios inside it, and people use it to produce music. You have to think about type the same way. You produce beautiful, well-proportioned type by choosing notes from the scale and not just choosing them at random. And maybe it's a little hard to see up here, but when you choose from the scale, sometimes it's hard to say exactly why, but you look at it and it has a pleasing sense of size, of hierarchy. It leads the eye around the page in the same way that like choosing like a major scale sounds nice and choosing a minor scale sounds sad. The same way, if you choose from the typographer scale, you're going to end up with something that looks relatively nice. So Google the typographer scale and choose from it. The second factor of proportion is measure, the width. You don't want to have your measure too wide. And the reason is that longer lines are harder to read for our eyes. How do our eyes actually read? It's not like a computer. We don't read one character at a time. We read with these movements called eye saccades. And basically, our eye fixates on the beginning of a sentence, and then it can see a little bit around that area, and so you're reading around the beginning. But then when you reach the edge of that area, your eye has to jump forward to the middle of the sentence, and then it can see around it a little bit more. But that's how you read. Your eye jumps forward in these little jumps. And if you make the line too long, then your eye is more likely to jump, one line down or up. Who here has been like awake reading late at night and you find yourself having trouble staying on the same line when you're reading? Like you read, and then all of a sudden, wait, you're on the wrong line. Hold on, let's go back. Like that's the experience that you're making more likely if your lines are too long. And as a general rule, and you'll see this over and over again, general rules to be followed generally, except if you know otherwise. 66 characters per line is widely considered like the ideal measure. Except in things like newspapers, places where people's eyes get distracted very quickly, and that's why in mobile you want your text to be a narrower measure, because then people have an even easier time. If you're like on a train and you're being moved around, or a bus and you're reading a newspaper, you want that column of text to be narrow so your eye stays still. Leading is the third kind. Good and bad. You don't want to have too little leading because once again, people's eyes will jump between lines. So yeah, when you're setting type 1.3 to 1.6 ems, don't set it solid, like don't set it at 1. Don't do single spacing. And the longer lines you have, if you have longer lines, they need more spacing to prevent people's eyes from jumping. There's also the matter of proportion between letters, right? If you take type, just especially for really large type, you need to actually reduce the spacing between them to make them look normal. They might look normal at small sizes, but when you blow them up, you have to start fine-tuning the spacing between these letters. That's called kerning, especially for letters that fit together like a W and an A and a V. So yeah, really large type you want to put together. So if the macro is about proportion, the micro is about the properties of the typeface, right? And typefaces, fonts, it all comes from, different scribes, how they actually used to draw letter forms. And different styles of drawing turned into different fonts. And when we started doing things on the screen, we have pixels. But okay, we have this shape, and that's the outline, and that's how we used to be able to present it. And then we came up with anti-aliasing so we can make our letter forms smoother. But nowadays, it kind of matters less because these high density, like retina displays, are making this not as important. Generally, when you're talking about the micro in that, your first choice is serif or sans serif. Serif faces are the ones on the top. They have the little serifs on the edges, whereas the sans serifs don't. Everybody knows like Georgia or Times is a serif, and Helvetica or Arial is a sans. There's actually, for a long time, people say you should use serif as a body type. It turns out that, and not a sans. It turns out that it's not strictly true, like this sort of old bit of wisdom, this old chestnut of serif for body and sans serifs for titles is kind of just a matter of convention. When you actually look at the science, it doesn't matter. People expect to see a newspaper printed in a serif face. If you show them a newspaper printed not in a serif face, they'll be all weirded out. But it doesn't actually affect their readability in like double-blind studies. It's just a matter of expectations. So choose something appropriate for your audience. But even within serif faces, there's a lot of different ones. They all have like different voices. They communicate differently. And type is a valuable channel for setting tone. Like you want to make users feel a certain way. Like what kind of type are you going to use? Something that's businesslike and very clean, or maybe a little bit more decorative. You can use type to set to communicate something that you don't say when you're presenting text to an audience. And two similar typefaces, you don't want to use similar typefaces that are like too similar to one another, because it's like wearing like stripes with plaid or something like that. It's like they clash. You want to have things with more contrast. So don't choose two different ones that are too similar. And if you do choose typefaces, don't choose more than two, because if you have more than two, you lose the ability to set that tone, and you're just going to confuse users. So yeah, pair for contrast, choose two, and make sure that they're sufficiently different, like a serif with a sans. So I'll wrap up and show just a couple of screenshots of like nice products and like how type is used. First one is Pinterest. Everybody knows Pinterest. It's actually kind of hard to see on the screen, like the lines and the boxes. But when you take away all of the graphical content, what you're left with is effectively a layout that's composed of boxes and type. Okay? And this is actually surprisingly attractive. And when you think about it, it's not like there's no drop shadows and gradients and like lickable, glossy, whatever, and textures. They went very simple, and they built a very simple looking product. It's attractive. But they did it almost entirely using just type. And I can see how this sketch looked like. It looks almost exactly like this final thing. Like when they were designing it, I could see how they got from that to this. Same thing for another product called Ardio. Ardio is like Spotify, but without shitty design. Yeah, so Ardio, another great product. Again, almost everything here has to do with type and contrast, emphasis and de-emphasis, taking type that's less important and making it dimmer. And of course, the big famous example is Microsoft's new Metro flat design language. So, a lot of people don't like it. I think time will tell. Microsoft can educate this market, and we'll see how people think about this in a couple of years, basically. In the same way that like when Google does something or Apple does something, it becomes a convention by virtue of them having so much control over the market. So yeah, anyway, I've covered like a lot of stuff. If you have questions, come and talk to me. And now that you know this, like you'll see it around you everywhere in all the products. You'll be like attuned to it. It'll start bothering you, I'm sorry. Now you're gonna look at like most of the web and be annoyed. But that's a good thing because you'll start caring about this and you'll make better products. So go do that, and thank you.